We're going to start this evening with Anwar. Anwar Akhtar is a very old friend of mine. I think I met him when he was at Loretto Sixth Form College in Hume, when he was 18 or whatever. And he's done incredible, amazing things since leaving Hume. He ran the Gatecrash nightclub in Sheffield for a while. He ran Rich Mix in London, and he now runs a organisation called the Samosa, which is a Muslim cultural exchange organisation, which amongst other things brought Ashoka Theatre over to the National Theatre to create the play Dara, which we did a filming of in the autumn. So I've lost, where is Anwar? You're at the back, Anwar. So can I introduce Anwar Akhtar, please? Oh.
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's nice to be back in my hometown. Just came out of the station a couple of hours ago. Hopefully, David gave a very nice introduction, so I'm not going to say too much about the current work. If time allows, we might get to show a clip of the play Dara. It's probably the most significant thing I've done in the last year. I was the producer both on the Pakistan side and the UK side, and it ran at the National Theatre for 36 nights. I'd encourage you all to look it up online, and there'll be further screenings. But I'm going to go straight into tolerance and multiculturalism and maybe give a few things for folk to think about. So I'm just going to say, I'll say a few words to start with. You think about words or descriptions like integration, multicultural cities, multiculturalism, globalisation. They're all words, expressions, phrases that can be used to portray a way of life, a social policy, an ambition, or they can just be to describe how things are, how we live. They can be loaded with political agendas, and they can mean different things to different people. So let's take multiculturalism as an example. I personally think it's become one of those words now. It's almost like Islamicism or Brexit or Zionism, that can mean completely different things to different people, depending on perspectives and opinions. And for some, you might think multiculturalism, it's just the way we live. It's what we are. It's a natural fulcrum of globalisation almost. It's everything from Notting Hill Carnival, the music industry, fashion, the UK's very large and growing mixed race population. It's Zadie Smith, Amir Khan, Riz Ahmed, Hanif Qureshi, Idris Elba. It's a guy called Gerald, Soul to Soul, Chris O'Philly, Dizzy Rascal, on and on. Southall, Hackney, Brixton, Asian Dub Foundation, Birmingham, Rusholme and Leicester. You can call all of that multiculturalism. It could be Dubai being full of Geordie and Scottish engineers. It could be global capitalism, Canary Wharf. It could be Bollywood now using London as its second home, which has been quite useful for me in terms of career prospects as well, actually. It could be our football teams being owned by foreign oligarchs with dubious ethics. Declaration of interest, given that I'm surrounded by architects and urban planners. For me, Claremont Road, Manchester, where the Kipak stood, will always be one of my favourite places in Manchester. So there you go. And the Glaziers are not anything to be too proud of anyway, in terms of dodgy owners. But for others, multiculturalism can represent something else. It can be segregated communities. It can be racial tensions. It can be gang culture. Communities where some people don't seem to want to integrate. It can be concerns about gender, inequality, educational and social underachievement, exclusion. And I think it's got to the point now where when you say multiculturalism, you almost have to clarify which multiculturalism you mean. Brixton, where I live, Rusholme, where I grew up, are very different places from Oldham, Doncaster and Rotherham. Yet all could be described as multicultural or multi-ethnic or mixed communities. So I think there's a whole set of issues around class, around poverty, around segregation, alienation, that you have to take into account as well when we are discussing multiculturalism. And so, I mean, just going back a little, I mean, from my own personal perspective, Manchester became a multicultural city, or at least the ball started rolling in that direction, sometime around 1744, which was when Shropshire lad Robert Clive arrived as part of the East India Company in Mumbai, India, and started a gradual process of quite belligerent trade, settlements, colonisation that led to metamorphosised into the brutal exploitation of empire. And the trade included spices, wheat, cotton. And the cotton, as well as much of the rest of the wealth that was taken from India, of course, came to Cottonopolis and helped fuel the extraordinary industrial revolution that my hometown Manchester underwent. And approximately 220 years later, my parents left the Punjab in the part that's now in Pakistan, was previously in India, and came to Manchester. And so, you know, I take some personal pride. I'm quite pleased that so much of Manchester's textile and retail sector today now involves many of my own direct family. The empire strikes back, if you like, a small contribution to the arc of Manchester's history by the Akhtars. Now, the point I'm making here, multiculturalism, it's a human phenomenon in today's world, like globalisation, which you can't really stop. It just is, regardless of how much angry Colonel Blimp types like Nigel Farage and Norman Tebbit might wish to. You know, you can't King Canute-like turn back the tide of multiculturalism or globalisation. And, yeah, I mean, looking around this room as well, you know, we're all from somewhere else, okay? I mean, most people in this room looking around are white. I presume most people are English whites with a few Europeans. And basically, if you're white and you're English and you were born below Birmingham, there's a good chance you're probably part French because of the Normans. You know, if you're from near the northeast, you may be descended from Vikings. So I just thought I'd put that down. Anyway, that brings me on to the subject of today's event, which is tolerance. So I tend to get there eventually. I go off on all sorts of tangents, but I normally arrive where I'm meant to be. So when we say tolerance, you know, I've been thinking about what we mean by it and what we should not tolerate. Okay, so I grew up in Rusholme, and I was part of Manchester's anti-racism activist groups of the late 80s and 90s. I'm from that generation where people of all backgrounds came together to oppose the National Front and the BNP through organisations like Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League. David was popping about quite a bit then. He looks exactly like he does now as well. He's not aged. So, and it was a time in the 80s and 90s when racial violence was every day in parts of the UK. And, you know, you can take great comfort if you look at some of the great cities of the UK today, Birmingham, Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, and you can see how far we've come from those difficult days, though we always have to be on our guard against the likes of Farage and Nuttall, who seem quite keen on going back there. So it's about, for me, this is about identity, it's about plurality, it's about heritage, and it's about soul. And I was a generation of that generation. I was determined, like many of my peers, that Tebbit and Thatcher would not define what it was for us to be British, and we weren't going to be fitted into their little box. So we fought very hard to get that most precious of things, cultural space in the polis. You know, from Diwali and Eid celebrations in our civic buildings and calendars, to wanting Gandhi and Jinnah and Nehru and C.L.R. James and Frantz Fanon on college curriculum, to wanting a recognition of the million soldiers from India, what's now Pakistan, Bangladesh and the Caribbean, that fought in World War I and World War II, to enjoying cricket on our terms. And, you know, don't underestimate how important cricket is to people with Asian or Caribbean ancestry. So, and later, for me, it became about ownership of space. And I was part of a team that helped set up the Rich Mix Arts Centre in East London, one of a few major, securely funded major arts venues in the UK that focus on platforming new work from BME artists, incubating new work from Black and Asian artists, and providing workspace. And I'm going to be quite blunt here, so I think sometimes someone in my position is allowed to be, and often many people aren't. I really strongly feel the arts and the media in this country has still got a colour bar, not that different from what we had in the 80s. Most white-led, white-focused arts institutions, they tend to do that really condescending thing of a couple of DJ workshops or an annual fancy dress parade funded out of petty cash, whilst the main funds, the main space, the main programming always goes to the same elite networks, usually middle class and usually quite monocultural as well. But I'm going to come back. I'm going to try not to rant about that because I've worked in that area for so long. I want to come back to something quite personal. It's a real jaw-dropping moment for me that made me question many things about multiculturalism and tolerance. So I recall a few years ago, there was a Muslim religious cleric from Bradford being interviewed on the news about schools in Bradford. And he had that look that has been so demonised in the media now, the long beard, prayer hat, orthodox clothes. And to many of you, he will appear alien, the other from another world, another culture, someone you don't really understand and you might be a bit wary of. Now, I looked at him and thought, one of my Uncle Ali's mates is on telly again. And then he said something that was utterly appalling. And there was a controversy about Muslim girls in Bradford not being allowed to do sports, including swimming classes at school. And this man said words to the effect of, it's not in our culture for girls to have swimming lessons, and our culture must be respected in a multicultural society. And apparently he had a few supportive counsellors as well. And it really shook me. It really shook me that the work of the anti-racist movement was in a way being twisted by a bigot to enforce misogyny and marginalise young girls from all the opportunities that they deserve in life. And it's a simplistic thing to say, and it's something Amin alone, who's going to be here later at one of the later talks, has done a huge amount of brilliant work. But, the Muslim community has its own versions of Farage and Nuttall. They just tend to focus their bigotry on women. But, I'm getting near the end now, and I want to kind of focus in on some very current things. And one is, I want to say a few things about what I think is quite possibly the most stupid, ineffective, counterproductive government initiative since the poll tax and Clause 28. Operation When in a Hole, Let's Keep Digging, otherwise known as the Prevent Programme. Okay, but to do so, I'm going to have to cover some recent history and some of my own background, crucial to understanding why the Prevent Programme is a disaster. I've spent a lot of time in Pakistan, both as a child and as an adult, and it's been heartbreaking to watch the sectarian violence unfold there and even worse in neighbouring Afghanistan. But here's the uncomfortable truth for all of us. We helped pay for it, along with our allies, the women and minority-hating, genocide-sponsoring House of Saud. The House of Saud are a small ruling elite made up of very few powerful families in Saudi Arabia, who also funded and helped set up Al-Qaeda, ISIS and the Taliban, and we all know the havoc they've wreaked over the last few decades. And the House of Saud don't represent Islam or Muslims any more than the Medici's or the Borgias or the Ku Klux Klan represent Christianity. And if we were really serious about a Prevent programme that engaged working class Muslim communities in Britain and challenged sectarianism and intolerance, the first thing we would do is close down the Saudi Arabian embassy because they're funding so much of it. But that's not possible, given the billions they have invested in Britain and in industries such as BAE Systems and their long-standing patronage of the Conservative Party. So the establishment ignore this deceit and contradiction. They have little choice, frankly, as I've been told quite bluntly by senior government officials, given the economics involved. And instead they came up with a Prevent programme focused on bullying school kids and working class British Muslim communities in places like Bradford, Leeds, Manchester. It's Dr. Strangelove stuff. And every British Muslim can see through it as a sham and an insult to their intelligence. So we've all got to share responsibility for the difficult issues we face globally that are being played out in our cities today. And I despair, actually, of what I see as a collective amnesia about how the West invested in religious fascism in South Asia throughout the 1980s. The Taliban, funded by House of Saud, by the UK, by the USA and the Pakistani government, and sold to us as the good guys defeating Russia in Afghanistan. And it's worth just remembering the Hollywood films of the time, James Bond, Rambo, and more recently Tom Hanks in Charlie Wilson's War, because we have got a collective amnesia about what we did and what we facilitated there. And of course, Western foreign policy led, partly, the Muslim community has also got a lot of responsibility, obviously, to the challenges we face today. But if we could just acknowledge, and it would mean a lot to working class kids in places like Rusholme and Longsight and Bradford, if we could just acknowledge that it's not their cultural responsibility, they're not responsible for it, they don't need indoctrinating in schools, and we could get the United Kingdom's cultural, media and political establishment to look at the history of the 20th century in a more honest and open manner, rather than blame and bully school kids and university students through a PREVENT programme. That would actually really help tolerance, challenging sectarianism and challenging hatred. And I would argue it also help gender equality as well, because the animosity against the PREVENT programme is also used by right-wing Muslim organisations to argue that, you know, it's an attempt to undermine Muslim history and gender equality is a diversion. And the PREVENT programme plays right into their hands, sadly. But, you know, a much better thing would be to have the 20th century's history, the good, the bad, the ugly, the one thing after a bleeding other, on O-level, A-level colleges and university courses, and engage young people in a very challenging way to study literature, the arts, media and history and their place in the arc of history, and engage young people with the complexity of world politics, the power relations of empire, of cities, the plurality of Muslim history, and the Cold War conflicts of the last century. And I choose my words carefully here, but it's got to be better than listening to Hazel Blair's bleat on about integration. You know, there was a particular moment, a particular nadir, where, you know, Hazel Blair is not someone you look to for cultural depth, for historical understanding, was apparently running around Westminster with this dubious think tank called the Quillen Foundation, dictating which parts of Islamic scripture should be allowed to be studied in madrasas and schools and which parts don't. You know, and any Muslim will tell you the 5 pillars. I'm not practicing, but I come from an Orthodox family, so I grew up with it. You know, prayer 5 times a day, charity, fasting, going to Hajj, and bearing witness to the Prophet. Now, they are as sacred as, I don't know, the 10 Commandments. So imagine how you would feel if the Muslim equivalent of Hazel Blair's was telling you which one of the 10 Commandments you should follow. Or, you know, Hazel Blair's was to tell the Jewish community which parts of the Torah they should read and which parts they shouldn't. You know, idiocy, and alienated huge amounts of people. So, you know, we need to go back and engage, because this PREVENT programme is going to run and run. It's part of social policy, policing, universities. It's even and to the Muslim community, it's just it's just not welcome. It's seen as a deceit, and it allows, I would argue, nefarious elements in the Muslim community to actually do more damage because of the idiocy of PREVENT. So I'm going to stop, because I think I'm very much out of time, aren't I? David's kind of looking at me anxiously. So I'm just going to say, just to end on tolerance, I think that Britain, despite Brexit, despite Farage, despite Linton Crosby doing his work at the moment, and that's going to get really nasty, by the way, what he's going to throw around race during the election campaign, I think our major cities in Britain are more integrated and multicultural in a positive sense than any other places I have visited in Europe, the USA or Asia. And I think Manchester is actually a shining beacon of a positive, multicultural, tolerant environment. So thank you.